Hello. How is everyone doing today? Oh my, I gotta say, I continue to be terrorized by my cat this morning. So tired. Ah. But I had my breakfast, and I probably should have grabbed my coffee before I settled in. That's fine. I will. I think what I want to do this particular time is have the sprints be reading. I didn't actually get as much accomplished with the setting up of my commands last time. So we'll do commands and stuff at the end. Or not we will, but we'll do sprints that are just working sprints rather than reading sprints. And that is what we will do. Oh. Alize, is that you in the background? If it is, hello. Thanks for tuning in. Alrighty. Let's begin. Nice to see you, friend. Thank you so much for joining. It was now Reverend Stiffbones' turn to take a look through the spiritoscope. He, too, saw the shadow and saw it move. Owing to the circumstance that the light fell into the instrument from the side opposed to the standpoint of the observer, the part of the spirit turned toward Stiffbones' eye could not be clearly seen, but its outlines seemed to grow sometimes larger and sometimes smaller, from which he inferred that the spirit was a gnome, as they were said to be able to change the size of their forms. These observations were corroborated by Mr. Scalawag. Professor Cracker looked again, and having satisfied himself that there could be no possible mistake, he made a speech in which he said that it had been reserved for him to make the greatest discovery of this age, and that the existence of gnomes, which had heretofore been doubted by certain too skeptical people, was now an established fact, demonstrated by him for the first time in human history. But alas, quote, this world is but a fleeting show, end quote, and even the demonstrations of science cannot always be depended upon as absolutely true. For while the professor made his speech, the head of a little mouse appeared at the opening of the tube, and seeing the coast clear, the mouse jumped to the ground and ran away. How the mouse happened to come into the spiritoscope had never been satisfactorily explained. The committee looked perplexed, and Cracker grew red in the face. Errar humanum est, exclaimed Stiffbone. And Mr. Scalawag added, we are all liars. The best plan will be to say nothing about it. Although the committee did not believe thenceforth in spirits, it can nevertheless not be denied that a spirit of gloom rested upon them after this incident. A scowl rested upon the professor's face, and he admitted that for once in his life he had been mistaken. Don't start. Get up here. Come on. While they discussed this matter, the wind had changed from east by northeast to north, and now a light puff of air brought a piece of paper flying into the cave. Reverend Stiffbone saw it and picked it up. There were written upon it following verses. Sorry. O foolish mortal, by dull senses bound, within thyself the spirit must be found. Know thou thyself, and by self-knowledge know the lives above and in the world below. In every sphere, each being knows its own. To spirits only spirits can be shown. That's my Charlie. Show me. Let me. After reading these lines, Mr. Stiffbone handed the paper to the professor and asked him what he thought. The professor carefully examined the structure of the paper and said, "This is nothing but an ordinary piece of note paper manufactured in this country. There is nothing supernatural about it." "But the verses," answered Stiffbone. "They seem to refer to the subject of our conversation. How is this a coincidence to be explained? How is this coincidence to be explained?" "In a very simple manner," replied Professor Cracker, growing more and more excited as he spoke. "You, sir, have written these miserable verses yourself for the purpose of playing it on me. But let me assure you that even if I have been imposed on by a mouse, I am not going to be fooled by such a ragamuffin as yourself. Your trick was not clever enough for that." During this speech, the Reverend Stiffbone, with open mouth, stared aghast at the professor, and the word ragamuffin roused his temper. He said that such an ill-founded accusation was calculated to greatly lessen his respect for one whose capacity to judge he had anyhow always regarded as doubtful, and that he owed it to his own respectability as a clergyman to regard Mr. Cracker's calumnies as being those of a man in his dotage, if not a willful perverter of truth. "You were going to insist right now that I are sorely mistaken. I will bother you later." Cracker retorted again, and it is doubtful how the matter would have ended. But just at that moment, a long-drawn sigh was heard, coming from some invisible source, and at the next moment, a gust of wind followed that overthrew the spiritoscope, and sent Stiffbone's hat flying out other end of the dragon's den. Directly afterwards, the cave became illumined by a flash of lightning, and this was succeeded by a clap of thunder which caused the ground to tremble, and reverberated like the firing of a battery of guns throughout the clefts in the neighborhood. The committee stood aghast and terrified, looking at each other in a perplexed manner, and not knowing what to do. It appears that the sky had become suddenly overcast with clouds, and a storm gathered at the top of the Untersberg, while our friends were too much absorbed in their scientific researches to notice it. And now the rain began to come down in torrents, and the archway offered but little protection, for sheets of rain were blown in at the open side of the cave, and streams of water began to flow in every direction over the ground. In a few moments, the members of the committee and myself were drenched to the skin and did not know what to begin, but our guide, drawing aside the branches of the rose bush that had stood at the entrance, pointed out to us an excavation in the rock, which had escaped the observation of the committee, and he invited us to enter. Into this hole we crawled one after the other, and after proceeding a few feet, it grew wider and formed a hollow of considerable size. Here we were comfortable enough, only we were wet and the place was perfectly dark. Professor Cracker struck a light and lit a candle which he had happened to have in his pocket, and by that aid we discovered a passage leading still further into the interior of the hill. This we decided to explore. Professor Cracker entered with his candle, then came Reverend Stiffbone, after him Mr. Scalawag, and finally myself, each man holding on to the coat-tail of the one who preceded him. Thus we went on for a considerable distance, when suddenly a draught of cold air blew out of the professor's light. At the same time, Mr. Cracker's foot hit against some soft elastic substance of an unknowable kind, and directly afterwards he received a fearful blow upon his abdomen from something unseen. Turning around for escaping the invisible enemy, he received another blow that sent him flying heels overhead, overturning the Reverend Stiffbone, who in his turn upset Mr. Scalawag. They were all lying in a heap, and I heard Cracker's voice producing a series of most unearthly yells. But the Reverend Stiffbone, while begging for mercy and blindly grasping about, clutched the air and got hold of Mr. Scalawag's hair, who defended himself with his fists. But my observations were also cut short, for I had just time, as my eyes became accustomed to the darkness, to see a still darker object, rushing at me over the prostrate forms of my friends, when I myself received a severe blow upon my stomach that caused me to lose my senses, and for a moment I knew nothing more. About 1,000 feet below the summit of the Untersberg, and not very far from the top of one of its spurs. Chapter 3. Within the Untersberg. It seems that during the consternation caused by this event, I must have unconsciously wandered off, for when I gathered my senses again, I found myself in a strange labyrinth of rocks. In vain I tried to find my way back to the dragon's den. There were perpendicular walls and precipices encompassing me on all sides, and the only outlet which I discovered led me still higher up towards the main body of the Untersberg. The storm clouds had disappeared, and the sky was clear, but my mind, if there is such a thing, was somewhat confused. I did not know which was which. Owing to Professor Cracker's exposition about the unreliability of direct vision, I could not tell whether the things around me were actually there or whether they were merely the product of autosuggestion, trumpery, etc. More than once I bumped my head against a projected rock, because my method of observation was not scientifically trained enough to enable me to realize the actuality of the rock without a knockdown argument. I had always fancied before that if one receives an impression from an object, be it in the waking state or in a dream, an object or image of some kind must be actually present from which that impression came. Now I saw that, according to science, impressions may come from nothing, and may be only the products of the accidental friction of the brain molecules. I was therefore no longer sure if the existence of anything that had not been analyzed and attested to by a scientific expert. It seemed to me that the sun was about to set, and that I was still wandering on, querying whether I actually was myself or whether some gnome was playing a trick upon my imagination, making me believe that I was I. There was nothing to prove to me scientifically that the something or nothing which imagined itself to be myself was not something else entirely unknown to me, provided there was such a thing as, quote, myself, end quote, at all, which seemed rather doubtful. it having not yet been analyzed and its composition shown. I can, in truth, only say that something which somehow seemed to be myself, but to whom it seemed so I do not know, imagined itself to be I. But for all I know, there may be no, quote, I, end quote, and it may have been nothing but space. It seemed to me, or to something, that the setting sun was gliding the ice fields of the neighboring mountain peaks with floods of light, and I, or something, received or seemed to receive the impression somehow that tints of various hues, beginning with a dainty rose color, followed by orange, yellow, sea green, and ending with blue, were adorning the sky, if there was any, with clouds, apparently floating within the depths of space, whose existence has not yet been proven scientifically, seemed to appear like fleecy masses of pure silver lined with fluid gold. The vegetation, provided that there actually was one, appeared to be more scanty than below, and to consist mainly of clusters of rhododendron and occasionally a specimen of mandrake, gentian, or thyme, which was to be seen or imagined. Judging from certain impressions, which something that seemed to be myself appeared to receive, I seemed to arrive at the conclusion that there were rocks covered with green moss upon which grew various ferns and some ericus. Tranquility somehow seemed to reign supreme in this altitude, although this is a mere assertion which I am not prepared to prove, and I seemed to perceive nothing which could have led anyone to infer that the stillness was in any way interrupted, except by the song of a finch that was sitting or appeared to sit upon the branch of a tree, always supposing that the tree was actually there, and the croaking of a flock of ravens which were flying, or seemed to be flying, around the top of the Untersberg. I say all this with a certain reserve, and confess myself unable to prove it, because direct vision is unreliable, and I had no spiritoscope at my command. I say that all this seemed, to whom, be as described. But even this is not scientifically exact or correct, for not knowing myself, how could I have the cheek to assert that I actually perceived anything or nothing or everything? How could I make an exact statement about myself if I am not acquainted with myself and do not know whether or not I exist? I love to be scientifically exact in my statements, and to avoid making wild assertions, I wish, or imagine to wish, to express myself in a manner leaving no room for the learned critic to misunderstand or misinterpret my words, and to speak so plainly that everybody must necessarily understand what I mean. But I find that this philosophical and roundabout way of describing things is very inconvenient, and that, for the reader's own sake, or the listener's, I cannot persevere in it. Why my mouth just... bleh. Everything in the world seemed to be only relatively true, and if we were bound to speak nothing but absolute truth, and express it in a manner that could not possibly be misunderstood by anyone, we would surely be doomed to eternal silence. I must therefore ask the permission of the reader and listeners to depart from this exact and strictly scientific method of speaking and circumscribing, and to do like people of common sense, and tell what I experienced or believed to experience as if I were really something whose existence had been proved and recognized by science, even if I have no other proof of my existence to offer, except that I am. This being myself is a reality to me, but it may be discredited by another, for there can be nothing real to anybody except what he or she realizes, and if they realize it, it is, or seems to be, real to them. During my visit in the Untersberg, I realized my existence, or seemed to realize it just as much as at any other time in my life, always provided that I exist and live. And the experiences through which I passed were just as real to me as any other experiences before or after that event. Let those who doubt my words or deny the possibility of what I described as having occurred doubt or deny to their heart's content. They cannot rob me of the satisfaction of knowing what I know. Somehow I felt myself more free than usual. My body moved without experiencing any fatigue, and I seemed to have no weight. Owing perhaps to the invigorating influence of the mountain air, I felt myself filled with strength. My mind was tranquil, my heart full of joy, and, as it were, one with the spirit of all nature, if I may be permitted to use such an expression. And it may be for this reason that I understood the language of nature as plainly as if it had been expressed in audible words, for the rushing of the distant waterfall spoke to me of eternal motion, the presence of the earth, of the substantiality of the universe, nourishing all things, the wide expanse of the air of universal freedom, and the fiery orb of the sinking sun of which an universal consciousness whose existence cannot be proved but which may be experienced by souls that are truly free. Even the flowers had a language of their own, speaking to me of purity, beauty, modesty, and similar principles unknown to modern science and not yet analyzed and classified. As I scrambled on, the scenery grew more wild. Huge boulders of enormous size often blocked the way, throwing fantastic shadows upon the ground. Slowly the sun disappeared behind the slopes of the western range, and solitary stars began to glitter here and there in the sky. The song of the finch had ceased, and the ravens gone to roost among the tops of the pines. But the more all animated things became silent and quiet, the more seemed life to become active in those things which are called inanimate. It was as if the inner life of nature awakened while the outward life went to rest. There is a voice that speaks to the soul in the stillness of night with words that are not to be found in the dictionary. Of course, Professor Cracker would surely call this a hallucination or a lie, but for all that, I know it to be true. The boulders around me looked like gigantic sentinels guarding the entrance to the kingdom of the gnomes, and asking me in their own language by what right I dared enter upon this forbidden precinct. Here and there, the trunk of a stunted tree, a larch or fir with crooked boughs, added to the grotesqueness of the picture, complaining to me bitterly in silent but nevertheless eloquent words that the soil in that place was too poor and the climate too rough to permit a full development of its qualities and a luxuriant evolution of form. At last I stood before a wall of rocks, at the bottom of which a dark cavern held its jaws permanently open, and a feeling of curiosity attracted me towards the entrance. I felt a sort of premonition that the mysterious depths of that cavern was holding for me a new revelation. The night had now fairly set in, but the moon arose in all her glory. It was, as already stated, the eve of St. John's Day, when fairies and elves are said to come nearer to our world to hold intercourse with mortals. The mysterious night when the ruby spark in the heart of the fern may be seen. A feeling of awe came over me as I looked into the cave and saw the silvery rays of the rising moon shining through the opening, revealing within the interior a lake of considerable extent. I went nearer, and now I beheld, as far as I could see, perpendicular rocks bordering the lake, with projecting nooks, holes, and crevices of unknown extent, while from the vaulted roof appeared like huge stalactites of curious shape. and a curtain of icicles descended, and the surface of the water glittered and sparkled in the moonlight, and the grotto looked like the cave of the nymphs in a fairy tale. I strained my eyes to behold the further end of the lake, but the background was veiled in darkness, and my sight could not penetrate through the mysterious gloom. Something seemed to draw my soul towards the realm of the shadow which the rays of the moon could not reach. And as I stood listening, a soft melody was wafted over the waters. Was it the breeze causing a ripple upon the surface which produced that melodious sound while playing among the icicles? Or was it the rhythmic dripping of drops of water from the vault overhead, causing faint echoes within these secret recesses? I cannot tell, but it seemed to me like a tiny voice of a woman, but of a woman of some ethereal kind. The melody seemed to express a longing for something unknown. It was like the cry of a newborn soul desiring to live and exist. It seems to me an impossibility to fully express in words the sentiments that were embodied in that song. It contained a desire for death or transformation, terms which mean the same thing, namely, the abandonment of one's state of existence for another. It embodied a wish for entering upon a higher plane of life and consciousness. The melody which I heard formed itself into a language whose meaning may perhaps be approximately expressed in the following words. Oh, what is this secret longing welling up within my heart? Unknown powers surging, thronging, rending solid rocks apart. Newborn joys and dying sadness, bursting clouds and opening sight. Something whispers, full of gladness, this is love, is life and light. These words formed themselves within myself without any conscious volition or ratiocination of my own. Ratiocination of my own. And what is still more surprising, they had a certain magical effect upon me. I felt as if I were myself entering into a new state of consciousness, such as I had never experienced before or since, and as if I had become a new being, endowed with a new kind of perception and memory. It was as if I had been asleep all my life and suddenly awakened for the first time. I now somehow knew that I was I, but I could dissect or analyze myself. I knew that myself was a unity and not a compound, and therefore incapable of being taken into pieces. I had never known it before, and knew of no authority on whose strength I would have accepted that theory. Nevertheless, I was certain of it, because I found that my self-consciousness was not composed of parts. And lo, as I stood at the border of that lake, bending forwards, and with all my senses on the alert listening to the song, I saw a radiance within the depths of that darkness, issuing from a circular luminous center. And as I concentrated all my attention upon it, this light grew brighter, and there appeared in the shape of a human being, a woman of supernatural beauty, in a mist-like silvery garment dotted with stars. Her long golden hair was flowing over her shoulders, and a radiant light shone upon her forehead. It was that light issuing, as I found afterwards, from a precious gem which illuminated her person and all the objects within its sphere. I dislike to tell what followed because I have no means of demonstrating its truth, and there will be undoubtedly many inclined to doubt it or to dispute it away, but if I had to give evidence before a notary public, I could not describe what followed otherwise than by saying that I was filled with an irresistible desire to approach that ethereal being, and that I made a step forward quite without being aware that I was stepping upon the lake. To my surprise, the water supported me, and I now think that it must have been solid ice, for I passed safely over it. And a moment afterwards, I stood in mute admiration before the most charming apparition of a lady of noble means. The lady of the lake looked at me with wondering eyes and smiled. This encouraged me, so I said, "Who are you, angelic being? If you will permit an intruder this question, are you one of the angels of—" "My name is Adelia," answered the lady, and her voice sounded like the music of the spheres. "I am the daughter of Bim Bam First, king of the Gnomes." "But what are you? Are you a spirit, hobgoblin, or a spook?" "I am neither the one nor the other," I answered. "I am—" But at this moment I could not, for the sake of my life, remember who or what I was. I had entirely forgotten my name and all that referred to my past. At last, while I was trying hard to remember who I was, it suddenly dawned upon me that I was an Irishman, born near the Lake of Killarney and living in Limerick. I am sure that if I ever was an Irishman, it must have been before I was born, but at that moment I was quite certain of it, and remembered my home and my family. I therefore said, "I am Patrick Mulligan, Esquire, if it pleases your worship." "There is a great deal of power in that name," replied the princess. "But what is your essential nature?" "A tailor, if you please," was my answer. But seeing that the lady did not understand what I meant, I explained that I was in the habit of making clothing. Upon this she asked, "Are you, then, one of these semi-intelligent forces of nature capable of assuming a form which, according to our traditions, are believed to inhabit the solid vastness of the element called air? One of these airy elements whose bodies are subject to change, mischievous beings that often cause explosions in our minds?" The princess stared at me, and I stared back. What she said about the solid vastness of the air was incomprehensible to me, until I found out later that the element of the air is just as impenetrable to the gnomes as the earth is to us. But what astonished me most was that, after having doubted the existence of elemental spirits of nature, I now found myself by one of them regarded as an element of the spirit of air. At last I said, "With your permission, I flatter myself to be somewhat more than semi-intelligent, and if I am a force, I am surely a substantial one. The fact is that I am a man, a member of the human family, a gentleman from the ancient kingdom of Ireland, and a descendant of Helbitha, the 123rd king of Ulster." "A man! A gentleman!" exclaimed the princess, full of astonishment and surprise, as if it was the most unheard of thing that one should be a man, and as if men and gentlemen were not much more plentiful in our world than gnomes and ghosts. This rather amused me, and I said to the princess, "I hope that I did not give offense to your honor. It seems that you are leading a very retired life, as you have never seen a man." But the princess paid little attention to what I said. Looking at me with her eyes wide open, she repeated, as if trying to persuade herself, "A man! Of course a man," said I. "What else could I possibly be?" "I have been told of the existence of such superior beings," at last said the princess. "Our sages teach that they belong to a now extinct race of divine or semi-divine beings who were kings of creation, and to whom all the laws of nature were subservient. They were said to be gods, and even superior to the gods in the wisdom and power, and that they were spirits, who sometimes assumed material bodies for the purpose of studying the conditions of the lower kingdom of matter." My vanity became excited by the description which the princess made of aboriginal man, and I did not wish to deprecate the good opinion which she had formed of me, so I merely nodded consent. "And from what region of the wide Empyrean have you descended?" continued the princess, folding her hands as if filled with admiration and reverence. "It is from Limerick that I come," was my answer. "I have never heard of that region of space," said the princess, "nor did I ever see any of the immortal beings who inhabit the sphere. But it is sufficient for me to know that you are a man, and I am permitted to worship you." My love to you is unbounded. All that I am belongs to you. To become united with you forever is my only desire. Let me adore you. In you I shall find eternal life. No words can express the looks of love and affection which the princess bestowed upon me while her rosy lips expressed these sentiments, and she sank down before me in an attitude of worship. I at once thought that there must be a mistake somewhere, and that she mistook me for something higher than I knew myself to be, but I did not wish to disappoint her. The straightforwardness of the princess in speaking out her sentiments in plain language and without any mock modesty delighted me very much. I then did not know that this was originally a natural quality of the gnomes, who, being themselves born out of emotion, cannot disguise the emotions which cause them to live. So I replied, I highly appreciate your condescensions, madam. Condescensions, madam. I do not doubt the sincerity of your words, and as I am fortunately not a married man, there is no objection to our entering into very friendly and intimate relations with each other. I do not know whether or not the princess understood what I said, but she continued to indulge in her expressions of love and admiration. Bending low and extending her beautiful white arms towards me, she cried out in rapture, Let me worship thee, O self-born, self-existent one, thee who was born before the world came into existence, and who will remain what he is even if all things perish. Thou who knowest no death, let me embrace thee and become one with thy divine nature. Let me hail thee, O Son of wisdom and Lord of creation, whose kingdom encompasses the sky, the earth, and the whole universe, whose self includes and penetrates all, to whom all power belongs and all glory is due. O infinite one, having shown thyself to me in a limited form, let me dissolve in the infinitude of thy being. Tell me, O man, how may I serve thee? I was very puzzled by this speech, and somehow felt that I did not deserve it. I had never known myself to be such a superior being as the princess described, but I saw that she was happy in her delusion, which afforded me a good opportunity to get my wish fulfilled, and obtain some knowledge in regard to the life of the gnomes. There was now a good chance to get the better of Professor Cracker and the likes of him. I therefore said, It is I, madam, who would always be at your service. But if you would do me a favor, I would, with your permission, take a look into the kingdom of the gnomes. Thereupon the princess crossed her hands upon her bosom, and bowing low, she said, Thy wish, O beloved and all-knowing one, is to me a command. Nothing shall hereafter separate me from thy glorious presence. Follow me, O my lord. Having spoken these words, her form dissolved, losing its human shape and becoming, as it were, a ball of light with a fiery center. This ball floated away, and I followed. Was it that there was something the matter with the rocks, or with myself? The walls of rock offered no resistance. We passed through them as we would pass through a London fog. It was such a strange experience that, if I did not know myself, I should be inclined to doubt my own words. We might have been traveling for about 10 minutes at the rate of what I should judge to have been about 10 miles an hour. The princess literally acting as my guiding star, with the fog, when the fog seemed to retreat on both sides, and in the open space I saw at a short distance a lot of other luminous balls, and in the midst of each there was a human-like form within a star, with a star upon its forehead, from which issued the light that formed the luminous spheres in which these beings lived and moved, each having its own peculiar light. Directly we entered and were in the midst of the gnomes. They were of various sizes and colors. Some were nearly as tall as I, others like dwarves. They were not all of the same brightness. Some were more luminous than others, and their stars more radiant. They had all some sort of an occupation. Some were quarrying marble, from which they made works of art and curious implements. Others were engaged in mining. By some means, which I afterwards found to be the application of a substantial energy, which might be called liquid electricity, they rendered fluid the gold that glittered in yellow veins within the snow-white quartz, and after letting it run into molds, the gold became solid and hard. There was no other light than what emanated from the gnomes themselves, and I saw that the amount of light in each individual indicated the amount of his or her spiritual energy and intelligence. Those that were luminous seemed to be very clever. Others, emitting only a faint glow, looked dull and stupid. And between these two extremes there were luminous spheres and radiating stars of different degrees of brightness, exhibiting various tints, and hues. But in the majority of them a tint of green could be perceived. They were what may be called spirits, in spite of all that may be said to the contrary by Professor Cracker, and their bodies were of a substantial kind. Their forms were not permanent, nor were they, as spirits, dependent upon the existence of their forms. In their normal and spiritual condition, they were like individual currents of air that blow here and there, having no particular shape. But they assumed or projected corporeal and organized bodies whenever it was necessary for them to do so, for the purpose of accomplishing some labor requiring a form. And in such cases each spirit assumed the same form again, which he had before he dissolved, and which corresponded to his individual character. And he did this not as a matter of choice, but of necessity, for such is the law of their nature, that to each character belongs a certain form of expression. A good gnome always assumes the same beautiful shape when he had in his previous embodiment, and whenever a wicked gnome dissolves and again took form, he acquired again the same distorted shape, the same features and clothing as before. But this is a digression, and I must continue my account. At my approach, those who beheld me first were very much frightened, and dissolved into spheres of light which grew less luminous as they expanded. This called the attention of the rest of my presence, whereupon what I would call a general scattering and dissolving took place. Everybody vanished, and from all sides resounded the cries, "A spook! A hobgoblin! A ghost!" Even the princess became affected by the general panic, so that she lost her presence of mind and disappeared, and the place would have been completely dark but for the fact that in the place of each gnome there was a fiery spark, corresponding in color to the light that belonged to each individual. Thus the whole place was dotted with sparks of varying colors, resembling jewels emitting magnetic rays. In the place of Adalia there was a beautiful pearl. There were brilliant diamonds, sapphires emitting a fine blue light, red glowing rubies, glittering emeralds, amethyst, smaragds, and other jewels of various kinds, some very tiny, others of considerable size, but all had the same mysterious luster, same quality of fire. The difference was only in the amount and color of the light they emitted. I then remembered some tale which I had heard of people who went into the Untersberg and found untold treasures of gold and silver and precious stones, but were too much dazzled by the sight of so much wealth that they entirely forgot to pocket any of the jewels and thought of it only after returning with empty hands. I therefore made up my mind not to lose this opportunity, and started to take one precious emerald, but a faint, childlike voice cried out to me, "Touch me not! Touch me not!" I then stretched out my hand towards the others, but from each and every one came the same answer, "Touch me not!" However, I was not to be disappointed, so I gathered my courage and I made a resolute grab at a great diamond. But on doing so, I received an electric shock that threw me upon the ground. At the same time, a clap of thunder reverberated through the hall, and the next moment the precious stones had disappeared. and I stood in the midst of a crowd of gnomes who were talking and gesticulating in an excited manner. They all looked upon me with indignation, and even Adalia's face expressed disappointment and doubt. But one of the gnomes, a very bright fellow, the one who had been the diamond, came forward, and, assuming a threatening attitude, shook his fist at me and angrily exclaimed, My page froze. Come on. This spectre has attempted my life! Why should we be afraid of a ghost that has no substance and this merely a compound of delusions? Let us drive it away. Make it vanish. In answer to this, as if by common consent, all the gnomes shook their fists and cried, Put it out! Let it be evaporated! This is a queer reception, I said to the princess. It is quite unexpected. I am neither a spectre nor a ghost, and not prepared to evaporate. I am a man! Then the princess came forward. Holding up her hand as a sign that everyone should be silent, she said, Do him no harm. Touch him not. He is a man. A man! Exclaimed the gnomes, pushing forward and staring at me, while the one who had spoken first asked the princess, How do you perceive him to be a man? He told me so himself, answered the princess. The general, was the reply of the gnomes. He said so himself. He told it to her, they whispered to each other. The threatening attitude of the gnomes at once changed into one of respect. A man! They exclaimed, and the cry was repeated until from all parts of the open space it was echoed back by many voices shouting, A man! And through all the caves of the Untersberg the cry was resounded. A man has come among us! A man! Let his name be blessed! All hail to Mulligan, the savior of our world! Now from all sides gnomes came forward and stared at me. Some were old, and others were young, men, women, and children, and some dressed in jackets, others in gowns, many wearing hoods upon their heads, those whose pointed ends hung down over their backs. I could not quite understand why they should be so much surprised at seeing a man, and expressed my surprise about it, saying that in the world where I lived, men were as plentiful as bugs on a tree, while gnomes were exceedingly scarce, so that hardly anybody seriously believed in their existence, and that nobody would dare to say openly that he ever saw a gnome, for fear that somebody might laugh in his face. Much better would it have been for me if I had been less loquacious, for I saw that some of the more intelligent gnomes looked now very indignant, and one of the wise ones came forward and said, Although you said you yourself that you are a man, nevertheless I perceive in you only an inferior being, perhaps a hobgoblin. For how is it possible that men, being omnipotent and all-knowing spirits, should not know that we exist, and that they would be afraid of speaking truth? Only a blaspheming elemental would dare to say that real men were subject to animal passions. How could the creator of all be ignorant of the existence of his creatures? How could he who rests on his own self-consciousness and is affected by nothing suffer from fear? I did not know what to say, but while trying to think of an answer to subdue the rising storm, for I saw that the gnomes were getting angry, the attention of the crowd was attracted towards the further end of the hall, where a large globe of yellow light appeared, which in coming nearer became condensed into a human form, appearing as a gnome of venerable aspect, with a jewel looking like a fiery topaz upon his head. He had a white beard and was dressed in a black cloak or cape, in short trousers, stockings, and buckled shoes. In his hand he held something that looked like a tube or telescope. He was, as I heard them say, Prince Kreftau, minister to the king. As he approached, all the gnomes became silent and waited in mute expectation for what he would have to say. He came up to me very close and looked at me through his tube, which turned out to be a spiritoscope. The time during which he examined me seemed to be an eternity, but at last he finished and spoke the ominous words, Umwa Sime vulgaris. I knew enough Latin to understand that he said that I was the ghost of a common ape. A general laughter arose, which followed by murmurs of dissatisfaction. Kravtow's unkind remark wounded my feelings, and I therefore said, "It is perhaps yourself who is the ghost and a monkey, Mr. Smarty. I am a man and never had any monkey in my family. My father was Thomas Mulligan, a member of a good standing in the church as anybody, and my mother's name was Bridget O'Flanagan, and they were married by Father Murphy, the parish priest." And talking myself into a sort of excitement, I proceeded to pull off my coat and continued, "Just come out of here, you brute, and I will show you whether or not I am a man. I will blacken your eyes and turn you into a kettle drum. And will make you think that 1,000 monkeys have come to scratch your head, you blackguard." It was evident that among all present there was none who understood my speech, and Adalia seemed to listen to it with delight. Revtau looked again and said, addressing the gnomes, "He is from the land of dreams, and the product of an illusion. There is not a spark of spiritual energy discoverable in him. His language appears to belong to a certain tribe of monkeys inhabiting the dark and impenetrable continent that lies beyond the confines of our kingdom, where all sorts of hobgoblins, devils, and monsters exist, whose greatest pleasure it is to torture each other. Among them you will find different degrees of insanity. They wandered about in the dark without knowing from whence they came or what will be the end of their journey, turning around in a circular dance, sometimes whirling in one direction and then again in another, always returning to the place from where they started without making any progress. Nevertheless, some of them are said to enjoy their condition because they do not know any better. They do not know their own selves, and they are not alive. They only dream that they live and mistake their dreams for realities. Some of them may even dream to be men. They are dreams in a dream. They have their imaginary dream knowledge, dream pleasures, and dream sorrows, and imagine them to be real. After a certain time, they evaporate. Something in Kravta's manner made me feel that there was a grain of truth in what he had said, and kept me from getting angry. But I did not like to hear a gnome speaking so disrespectfully of the human race. I therefore said, "I beg pardon. The place which you describe may be purgatory or something worse, but not our world, in which it is, after all, very pleasant to live. We are neither fools nor idiots, but we have among us people of great learning, scientists and inventors, and we have many things which are quite beyond the power of the comprehension of the gnomes." "Listen to that phantom," exclaimed Kravtau. "How every word of his confirms what I said. It would be impossible to convince the product of a delusion that he is only an illusion, because, believing himself to be real, all his delusions seem real to him, not knowing their own real self, but only what appears to be their self. They do not perceive anything real, but see only that which appears to be, never that which really is." Upon this, a general discussion took place. Some of the gnomes expressed their opinion that I might be a man after all without knowing it. Others said that they perceived that I was only a spook. Some thought I was a cheat, and others expressed their belief that I was the product of an autosuggestion. At last, some of the brightest gnomes held a consultation together, and when it was ended, one of the wisest looking came up to me and said, "We will allow you fair play. Men are all knowing, and if you are a man, you will be able to answer a question. Will you therefore have the kindness to tell us what is the cube root of the diameter of a circle having a periphery of 3,001? Or excuse me, that's not 1,000. 3.1415, if you please." This, of course, I did not know. Therefore, I said, "I am not a mathematician, and you will therefore have to ask me something easier. But even if I were expert in mathematics, I would require a piece of paper and a pencil to figure this out. The remark of mine caused a great deal of merriment among all the gnomes present. They jumped and yelled, and punching each other's ribs with the tips of their fingers, they cried, "Ho ho! He does not know the cube root of the diameter of a circle having a periphery of 3.1415! And from every corner of the place where groups of gnomes were standing, and from every projecting rock, where some of them were perching and listening, shouts of derisive laughter came back, repeating the suggestive and exasperating words. Ho ho! He does not know the cube root of the diameter of a circle having the periphery of 3.1415! This is very idiotic, I cried. How could anybody know anything without figuring it out or being informed about it? A triumphant smile appeared upon Kravtow's face, and Adalia looked downcast and perplexed, but my remarks only increased the hilarity of the gnomes, many of whom, upon their heads and swinging their legs, roared, "He sees nothing! He knows nothing! He imagines to know what he is informed about! He knows nothing himself!" In the midst of the uproar, a blast of trumpets was heard. Order was immediately restored, and the gnomes whispered to each other, "The king is coming, the king!" A sound as of many tinkling silver bells announced the arrival of His Majesty, and immediately afterwards I saw a globe of red light of unusual size, accompanied by many smaller ones approaching, and directly I stood in the presence of Bim Bam the First, King of the Gnomes. The king, whenever he condescended to assume a corporeal form, appeared as a gnome of noble bearing, medium-sized and of middle age, having a yellow beard, while upon his head rested a crown with many stars, the greatest of them being a large carbuncle, emitting a living red light which enveloped his person, and caused everything upon which it radiated to appear in a red color. "What is all this row about?" asked the king. "Has Clotho forgotten to collect electricity from the clouds and to supply with vitality the roots of the buttercups on the eastern side of the mountain?" "Worse than that, your majesty," replied Kravtow, saluting the king. "A spectre from the country of dreams has dared to penetrate into your kingdom, and it remains with your majesty to decide what is to be done. It is an animal hobgoblin belonging to the third dimension of space." Thus speaking, he handed to the king the spiritoscope, through which Biban I took a long look at me, and returning it to his minister, he spoke only one word, "Empty." "What is most curious about it, if your majesty will permit," continued Kravtow, "is that this three-dimensional apparition dreams that it is one of those supernatural beings which once existed upon the earth and were called men." Upon hearing these words, the king broke out into such a roar of laughter that it was fearful to behold. He held his sides and laughed so that it shook the rocks and disintegrated some of them, while all the gnomes laughed with him. When the noise had subsided, Kraftos again spoke and said, "If it pleases your majesty to observe that the semi-intellectual forces in nature produced such elemental forms, they do nothing by their own volition, but act only according to the influences which act upon them. Anybody can make them do as he pleases." So saying, Kravto made a sign to one of the gnomes, whom afterwards I learned to be known as Clavo, and the commanding general of the army. He was a robust fellow, and very quick. Before I knew what he was about, he drew a pin, which he carried in a scabbard by his side, and stuck it into my back. I cried out and made a jump. "It is evident," said the king, "that he is an elemental. Spirits do not squeal and jump when they are struck with a pin." This remark annoyed me, and I howled, "I do not claim to be a spirit. I only said I was a man." His Majesty grinned ironically. "Who ever heard," he said, "of a real man who is not a spirit?" Kravtau then motioned to another gnome who carried a fiddle under his arm, and that fellow, understanding the order, began to play a jig. I am a great lover of music, and love to dance, and this surely was the best Irish jig I have ever listened to, but I did not want to make an exhibition of myself before the king, and resisted the impulse. It is evident, said the king, that he is an elemental. Spirits do not squeal and jump when they are struck with a pin. This remark annoyed me, and I howled. I do not claim to be a spirit. I only said that I am a man. His Majesty grinned ironically. Who ever heard, he said, of a real man who is not a spirit? Kravtau then motioned to another gnome who carried a fiddle under his arm, and that fellow, understanding the order, began to play a jig. I am a great lover of music and love to dance, and this surely was the best Irish jig I had ever listened to, but I did not want to make an exhibition of myself before the king, and resisted the impulse. At last, however, the music got the best of me. My legs began to jerk, and before I really knew what I was doing, I danced the jig as lively as I ever danced one in my life. He dreams that he is a man, said the king. He dreams that he is a man, said the king, but he is only a product of nature. If you stick his body with a pin, it jumps. If you fiddle to his legs, he dreams that he must dance. I do not perceive any spirit nor anything supernatural in him. He is only a composition of semi-intelligent forces of nature. One can make such a compound to do what one likes. We can make it amiable or disagreeable, cheery or sorry, angry or contented, envious or generous, jealous, furious, or whatever one likes. While the king spoke these words, the princess gave a faint cry, and as I looked at her, I saw that the silvery white of her star had assumed a bluish tint. It was noticed by all the gnomes, and they became very much alarmed. Her Royal Highness the Princess has fallen in love, cried Kravtau in a sorrowful tone, and the king quickly replied, Let the physician of the court be summoned immediately. These words were hardly spoken when the doctor made his appearance. He was an old fellow with a benevolent expression, wearing a blue cape with yellow borders. He had a gray beard, and he wore a pair of golden spectacles. Unlike our doctors, he did not ask the patient any questions. He did not feel her pulse, nor even look at her tongue, but like all gnomes, he knew things by direct perception, and saw immediately what was the matter with her. Turning to the king, he expressed his sorrows that such an unfortunate accident should have happened to a member of the royal family, and for the purpose of removing the cause of the disease, he advised the king that the object of the affection of the princess, meaning myself, should have his head sawed off immediately. To my horror, Dahlia consented cheerfully, and the king was about to give the required order when the doctor spoke again and said, If Her Royal Highness would consent to wait until the next night, I would propose to preserve the subject, and instead of sawing its head off, have it dissected alive in the presence of the medical faculty, as it would be very interesting to our physiologists to see what materials spooks are made of. If the princess would consent to have that much patience, the whole profession would be very thankful to her. The princess declared herself willing to wait, and said that the sensation she experienced was rather pleasant than painful to her. Thereupon the king said in a stern manner, See that he does not escape. put him under the jumping jack." So saying, the king and his suits turned to go. The jumping jack! What a horror crept over me when I heard these terrible words. My frame began to tremble and my hair stood on end at the very thought of this jumping jack, although I had not the faintest idea of what it was, but I imagined it to be some sort of instrument of torture. Soon, however, I had my doubts cleared up, for the head executioner, a strong fellow in a scarlet robe, together with his attendants, brought forth the instrument. It consisted of a yellow stick upon which a wooden monkey painted purple was with its hands attached to a movable crossbar at the top, leaving the body free to climb up and down. This they placed before me, planting the stick into the ground, and by means of some contrivance unknown to me, they set the wooden monkey a-going and quietly walked away, leaving me alone with the princess. I do not know how it came, but that wooden monkey exerted a powerful influence over me. I had often seen such jumping jacks at toy shops, but never experienced such an attraction before. I could not divert my eyes from that monkey. I called myself 1,000 times a fool for paying any attention at all to a jumping jack, and nevertheless it kept me spellbound. I could do nothing else but sit there with my eyes riveted upon that monkey. I knew that the princess was still with me, and I heard her imploring me with tears, by all that was sacred to me, to desist from paying attention to the jumping jack. "Dearest Mulligan," she cried, "why will you not desist from worshipping that monkey? Why will you not make love to me? See, the doors are open, and there is nothing to hinder us to depart. Have I not promised to follow you wherever you go?" "Leave me alone," I cried in rage. "I cannot take my eyes away from that confounded jack." "Is this your manhood?" continued Adalia, weeping and wringing her hands. "Are you a supernatural being, and the sight of a monkey can make you forget yourself and your promises?" "Is this your love and affection for me, which a purple monkey can steal away? Oh, Mulligan, Mulligan, leave off looking at that jumping jack and remember your duty. Come into my arms." "I wish that confounded hypnotism had never been invented," I cried, but for all that I was not able to break the spell. The princess kept on crying bitterly and begging me to desist. I heard her speak, but what she said had no effect on me. What did I care for a princess, while I enjoyed the sight of that dear jumping jack? I knew that if I did not control myself, I would have to remain in this situation and be tortured to death at the appointed hour. But what was that to me? I cared for nothing else but for the sight of that monkey whom all my affections were centered. I thought of the princess with entire indifference. Oh, how I loved that jumping jack! It was as dear to me as if it had been my own self. I could not think of anything but that jumping jack, and I involuntarily hummed the song in which my situation was so well portrayed by the world of a well-known poet. Willie had a purple monkey climbing on a yellow stick. It never occurred to me to lick off the paint. I knew nothing more. I was asleep with the jumping jack in my arms. Chapter 4. Among the Gnomes. While I was sleeping, I experienced a horrible dream. The jumping jack before me assumed the features of a baboon, having a great resemblance to Professor Cracker, and besides this, there were two grotesque figures standing at the foot of the pole. One was a wooden nutcracker with goggle eyes. a long nose and protruding chin, the very image of Jeremiah Stiffbone. And the other, a curious-shaped whiskey jug of stoneware having the form and features of Mr. Scalawag. And while the monkey was moving up and down the pole, the nutcracker and the whiskey jug danced, and all three sang the following song. Huzzah and heyday, up and down we go. There's been nothing that we do not know. We prove that back is white and point is black, and all the world admires the jumping jack. And as we jump, you go jumping all the rest. Who jumps the highest knows his business best. Forward and backward on the beaten track, there's nothing greater than a jumping jack. And to our stick we cling from first to last. Who asks for more is only fast and fast. Thus up and down we go, upward and back. This is the glory of a jumping jack. After they finished singing, the nutcracker sniffed the air with his nose and turned his goggles in the direction where I was hidden, after which his jaws began to move, and he said, "I am smelling human flesh. There is someone present." To this the whiskey jug replied, while grinning from ear to ear, "Who knows, but it may be Mr. Schneider or his—" "Mr. Schneider has no ghost," said the baboon. "If we were to find one, we would have to destroy it immediately to save the reputation of science." "I am quite sure that something of that kind is hidden somewhere," replied the nutcracker, and turning to the baboon he asked, "Do you see anything?" "Seeing is deceptive," answered the baboon, "but we will see whether we cannot reason it out. Wait till I come down." So saying, the monkey stopped his motions, and to my horror I saw him unfastening his hands from the crossed bar. Climbing down the yellow stick, he joined the whiskey jug and the nutcracker, and all three searched the place and almost stumbled over me, but they did not see me. "There is nothing," said the baboon. "However, there can be no doubt that Schneider is dead, and the only thing to be regretted about it is that he did not die in the interest of science. If we had known that he was going to die anyhow, we might have subjected him to certain experiments." Strange to say, during this dream I had no thought of being a mulligan, but my individuality was changed back to Mr. Schneider. When I awoke, Schneider was gone, and I was once more mulligan. "De mortis nisi bene," called out the nutcracker. "But if Schneider had died in the interest of science, it would have been the first useful thing he ever did." So saying, the nutcracker clapped his jaws. The whiskey jug blinked with his little eyes and added, "He meant well, but—" I knew what he was going to say, and this made me very angry. I therefore jumped at him and gave him a box on the ear, but my fist went quite literally through his head, and it had no other effect upon him than stopping his sentence. He did not seem to notice it, but I now knew that I had died and become a spirit. I also saw that I could take possession of people and use their organs of speech, and as the nutcracker was nearest to me, I went inside of him and caused him to exclaim, "I will show you whether or not I am a well-meaning fool. Confound you and your science! I have been among the gnomes and know that they exist, but you are the blind fools who cannot see anything because you are too stupid to open your eyes." "Brother Stiffbone has become insane," said the baboon. "Let us tie him up before he does any injury to us." Thereupon the baboon and the whiskey jug went for me while I was in the nutcracker's body, and I went in that shape for them. I snapped at the baboon's ear and gave him a black eye, and I tore out a handful of hair from the head of the whiskey jug, who in his turn broke that is to say, the nutcracker's nose. At last they got the best of me, because the wooden limbs of the nutcracker were so stiff that I could not move them quickly enough. We fell down, and the baboon was kneeling upon my breast when I awoke. Once more I was Mr. Mulligan. I opened my eyes and found myself first thing I did was to feel my nose to see whether it was broken. The nose was all right, and the solidity convinced me that I was no ghost, and my adventure with the Nutcracker's body, however real it seemed, had only been a dream. I groped about for the purpose of finding the jumping jack, but it was gone. Neither did I regret its absence, for with the sight of it, all of my affection for it had departed, and I could not understand how I could have been so foolish as to permit myself to be attracted by it. My desires for the purple monkey had left me, but my love for the princess returned. I yearned for her presence and called her name, but no answer came. There was nothing around me but darkness and solitude. Ever since that event, I have often asked myself, why do we hate to be, for a long time, alone? The only answer I could find is that when we are alone with ourselves, the company of ourself is not sufficiently satisfactory and agreeable to us. Perhaps we do not sufficiently know that self to fully enjoy its presence. Perhaps we do not know that self at all. And then, of course, we are in company with something we do not know, which means in company with nothing. And to enjoy the presence of nothing is to have no enjoyment at all. I confess that I never realized my own nothingness so much as on that occasion. The old doubts returned again. I did not know whether I was living or whether something which imagined itself to be I seemed to live, and if that which only seemed to be myself was to be vivisected, why should I trouble myself about it, as the vivisection of something unknown to me did not concern me at all, unless I voluntarily choose to take any interest in it. But how could I think of making any choice at all if that, quote, I, end quote, was something unknown? I instinctively refused to recognize as myself that personality which was governed by the spell of a jumping jack, and I spoke to myself as if I were another person. Well, Mulligan, I said, how could you be such an idiot as to submit yourselves to the power of a baboon? Really, I doubt whether you are a man. Pshaw! The gnomes are right. You are a monkey yourself, and even inferior to a monkey because the baboon was your master. A nice lord of creation you are, being controlled by the creation of your own foolish fancy. A lord of creation indeed. One who cannot even resist the attraction of a jumping jack? Thus I went on moralizing, and wondered what my real ego was, and whether it had anything at all to do with what seemed to be myself. I wished to know whether I, that is to say, my real self, was. For that purpose I was in the world. For what purpose was I in the world, and where I had been before? Where had I been before I entered this one, and what that was which caused me to be born, and whether I could be born again after I, that is to say, my body, had been dissected? Alas, for all these questions Cracker's science had no answer to give, and I envied the gnomes who had the ability to dissolve and condense into bodies at will. The darkness was very oppressive, and I wished that I could be self-luminous like a gnome, and not be dependent upon an external light for the purpose of seeing. I wondered whether perhaps after the dissection of my body, my spirit would have a light of its own, or whether Bim Bam was right when he pronounced the suggestive word empty. Then something, of which I do not know what it is, made me think that the worst thing anybody could possibly do was doubt or deny the presence of a spiritual light within himself. And while I studied as to what may be that which made me think so, I came to the conclusion that it was my own spirit reminding me of its presence, and this was a more convincing proof to me that I actually had a spirit than all the arguments offered to the contrary by Professor Cracker and his ilk. With this conviction, a great deal of calmness and satisfaction came over me. At the same time, the darkness grew less in intensity. A silvery mist, tinged with blue, arose like the dawn that preceded the rising sun. The light grew stronger and condensed in a luminous ball, and the next instant the princess stood before me. "Dearest Adalia," I said, "where have you been so long, and why did you leave me alone in this horrible darkness?" To this the princess answered, "Truth never departs, but error always attracts us. Never for an instant have I deserted you. I was with you and around you all the time, but you kept your eyes closed and refused to see me." "On the contrary," I replied, "I strained my eyes to look through the darkness, but there was nothing." "You strained your eyes," answered the princess, "for the purpose of seeing my form, which was not formed, and which could not be seen, but you made no effort to see that which is without form, but which may be seen with the inner eye. Know, my beloved, that when you see my form, you do not see me, and when you do not see my form, you may see me in truth." "This," I said, "is contrary to all the doctrines of our science, which teaches that we can see nothing whatever unless it has a shape of some kind. The eyes of science see only the outward form," answered Adalia, "but the eye of wisdom sees the reality itself." "I understand," I replied. "I have learned a lesson, and henceforth the delusion caused by forms shall have no more power over me. But tell me, dear, is the hour of vivisection approaching? Is there no way for escape?" "Alas, no," sighed the princess. "There is a jumping jack at every door." A thrill of horror swept through me when I heard these words and made me tremble. A moment before I had called myself a fool for being afraid of a jumping jack, and now, at the very mention of such a toy, the old terror came back. I knew that I could not escape, because I would not dare to face a jumping jack again. I would be sure to succumb to its influences. "But," continued Dahlia, "why should you be afraid of being dissected? Can you not create for yourself a new body again?" "Nonsense!" I cried. "I am not a creator." "But sure enough," answered the princess, "you have a creative spirit in you. Oh, my dear Mulligan, why will you remain incognito among us? Why do you continue to be dark? Why will you disguise yourself before me? Is it that I am not worthy to behold your true light, or that my eyes would be dazzled by its splendor? Lord of my heart, unveil yourself to me. Show yourself to me in your own essence." "Dearest princess," I replied, "I do not know what you are talking about. I am not luminous, and I never saw a luminous man. In our country, nobody has a light of his own." "Alas," said the princess, "what a fearful fate it must be to have no light and to live in a country of perpetual darkness." To this I replied, "This is not so. Nobody in our country needs a light of his own, because we have one great luminary called the sun right over our heads, and the light of that sun illuminates our world." "And can everyone see the sun?" asked the princess. "Of course," I said. "Everybody, unless he is as blind as a bat." When I spoke these words, the princess threw her arms around my neck and whispered to me, "Dearest Mulligan, I have a favor to ask you. Please, fetch me the sun." "This is quite impossible," I said, "for although we all live in the light of the sun, nevertheless we cannot approach it, nor put him in our pocket." But the princess was not satisfied with that answer. "Surely," she exclaimed, "you told me that the sun was right above your heads. You ought not to refuse me the first kindness I ever asked of you. I implore you to bring me the sun. I will not be contented unless I have it." I became alarmed. "This is a foolish request, madam," I said. "If somebody or anybody could claim the sun as his own and carry it away, there would be little chance for anyone else to enjoy it. The government would monopolize it and put a tax upon it and its use. The doctors would dissect it to see of what material it is made, and there are lots of amorous fools who would not hesitate a moment to make him explode. merely for the purpose of amusing their sweethearts. But it was of no use to argue such a thing with the being unacquainted with the first rules of logic, and the princess went on with tears and sobs to beg me to fetch her the sun. I tried my best to explain to her the absurdity of that request, but she would not listen, and, weeping bitterly, she cried, "Oh, Mulligan, you do not love me! Is this your gratitude for bestowing my affections upon you?" I felt very miserable, and began to look upon myself as the most ungrateful wretch, and to appease her, I promised that I would try to do all I could. At this moment, a blast of trumpets and the tinkling of bells announced the arrival of the king. He was accompanied by the queen and her suite, and with them came all the nobility, the ministers, officers, and also the whole of the medical faculty, together with the head executioner and his assistants. The queen was a little fat woman, rather homely. On her head shone a great emerald, throwing a soft green light around her. She was accompanied by her maids in waiting, all of whom appeared in the same green color. I made my bow to the queen, who, after looking me through the spiritoscope, turned to the king and said, "Is this green hobgoblin who has impudence of claiming that he is a man spirit?" "Yes," answered the king, "only, as you will observe, he is not green, but red." "Your Majesty is pleased to jest," replied the queen. "Everybody sees that he is green." "He is red," said the king sternly, being evidently annoyed by her contradiction. "Let him be red, then, if you must have it so," answered the queen, her voice indicating vexation. "But he is green, for all that." "Well, I declare," exclaimed Bim Bam first, growing still more red. "I never saw a woman in my life that did not love to contradict. I say he is red, and I will leave it to Kravta to decide." Kravta stepped forward, letting his yellow light fall directly upon me, and after scanning me carefully, he replied, "I beg your pardon, Majesties, but the hobgoblin is of a yellow color." "Are you making sport of me?" cried the king in a rage. And turning to the princess, he asked, "What does the dahlia say?" "He appears to me in a silvery light shaded with blue," answered the princess, "but according to his own statement, he does not shine at all." The gnomes looked at each other in amazement, and Kravtow said, "He is a wizard who appears to everyone in another light." But the princess continued, "Although he does not shine, he has a much greater light than we all, for it shines upon everything. He calls it a sun, and he has promised to fetch it for me." Therefore the king ordered that I should immediately show him the sun, and when I succeeded in making him understand that it could not be removed from its place in the universe, and that the only way of convincing oneself of its existence was to step within the sphere of its light, the king ordered Kravtow to select immediately a committee of 3 of the most clever gnomes for the purpose of going to the country of dreams and to hunt for the sun. Accordingly, 3 gnomes of rank were selected. They were of a white color, and the light that radiated from them was so brilliant that it dazzled one's eyes to look at it. They immediately assumed their spherical shapes and floated away, but the king ordered that my execution should be stayed until after their discovery of the sun. When I heard these words, I felt much relieved in my mind, for I had now some hopes of escape. "May your Majesty persevere in that resolution," I said to the king, "for these 3 messengers will never discover the sun. They have 2 splendid lights of their own. To be able to see beyond it, they will be dazzled and blinded by their own radiance, and not look for the light of the sun." Upon hearing these words, everybody seemed highly astonished. The gnomes looked at each other in surprise and whispered, "He is a prophet. He can foretell the future events. This is quite supernatural." "It does not require any supernatural powers," I said, "to be able to foretell that a thing cannot take place on account of its being impossible. Everybody knows that a certain amount of darkness is required for the purpose of enabling one to perceive light. Those who are full of their own light cannot see the light of another, just as those who love who hear only themselves talking will not listen to what others say." "Wonderful!" exclaimed the king, and Kravta whispered to him, "He is one of those who sees what is not." But I continued speaking. "If your majesty wishes to obtain information regarding the existence of truth, I would advise you send a committee of such as are less conceited and capable of seeing beyond the walls which their egoism has built around them." I was still speaking when the three gnomes returned, and they reported unanimously that they had been to Dreamland, and that they had seen no other light but their own, and that it was an absurdity to believe in the existence of a universal sun. For if there was such a light, it could not have escaped their notice, and moreover, the presence of such a light would make everybody look of the same color, so that not one person could be distinguished from another. Thereupon all the dark gnomes, such as had a little light and intelligence as possible, were gathered, and out of them the king selected 3 almost entirely dark dwarves. They were surely the most sorry-looking imbeciles which it has ever been my misfortune to behold. Big-headed, hydrocephalic, with sunken brains, they were the very personification of abject stupidity. They seemed to have not more understanding than an oyster, although their power of seeing appeared good enough. These were appointed as a committee to seek for the sun, and it was ordered that they should be conducted to the frontier of the outer world, there to be left to their own fate and to begin their researches. This was accordingly done. The 3 idiots were taken away, and I pitied them, for I doubted whether they would ever have sense enough to find their way back. "I am curious to hear the report of this committee," remarked the queen. "Perhaps it would have been still better to blindfold them." To this I replied, "I fear that your majesty will be disappointed, for even if the dwarves perceive the sun, they will be incapable to understand what they see or to describe it." "Hear, hear!" exclaimed the king, and all the gnomes began to regard me with awe and respect. But Kravta said, "Really, there is more behind this person than we suspected. He is one of those who sees that which cannot be seen." Thereupon the king conferred upon me the office of head fortune-teller to the court, and I was treated with great respect. The whole behavior of the gnomes changed. The queen smiled at me and invited me to the palace, but the princess was delighted, and as she took my arm, she said to me with a triumphant smile, "I knew that you were more than a spook after all." We arrived at the king's palace, a description of which will undoubtedly interest the reader and listeners, and I only regret my inability to do full justice to this subject. The palace consisted of an extensive building of white alabaster upon a rose-colored marble foundation, and with a gilded, dome-shaped roof over the main portion of the building, while the adjoining parts were shaped in various ways. The whole represented a mixture of Grecian and Moorish styles. There was a high portal whose columns were of white marble with veins of gold. Entering through the main door, we came into a spacious courtyard, filled with works of art representing antediluvian monstrosities of the various ages of the world. There we saw the ichthyosaurus, the plesiosaurus, and the megatherium, and similar animals unknown in history, enormous snakes, turtles, and crocodiles, in what is supposed to have been their original size and shape, and besides these there were represented such failures of nature as may have existed in the earliest time of the world's history. Women with fish tails, human bodies with animal heads, and animal bodies with human heads or limbs, fauns, mermaids, satyrs, centaurs, flying snakes, dragons, and so on. Curiously enough, the gnomes claimed that these were the representations of their ancestors, and they paid great respect to them. This courtyard extended all around the palace, surrounding it like a ring. From this court, we entered into an entrance hall built of yellow stone, at the door of which there were standing two gigantic umbrella-shaped mushrooms of scarlet color with white filaments, resembling the finest of lace. This hall was exquisitely furnished and ornamented with various mushrooms, all of an edible kind, affording at once comfort and food. For while resting upon a lounge or sitting at a table, if one wanted to eat, all he had to do was to eat a piece of furniture. There was the Agaricus deliciosus, Procerus, Tempestrius, Prunulus, Boletus edulis, Polyporus confluens, Hydrum repandum, and Imbretum, and the Claveria botrius, Morcella, Escontella, Helva crispa, Bovista nigrescens, and many others, whose names in the Latin I have forgot, and still others which even Professor Cracker had not yet classified. They were serving either as tables, couches, or chairs, and there was not a single toadstool or poisonous fungus among them. There were no chandeliers, lamps, or candlesticks of any kind, for the gnomes lived in a natural manner and needed no artificial light. Each gnome was himself a light more or less luminous according to the degree of his or her intelligence. But to me, having no light of my own and no power to illuminate anything, it was a source of continual annoyance that I always needed the company of some gnome to keep me enlightened, otherwise I would have been left in utter darkness and nothingness. Moreover, the light in which a thing appeared to me always depended on the color of the light of this or that gnome who happened to be in my presence, which caused me to experience a continual change of opinions regarding the quality of the objects I saw. From this hall, a flight of 7 marble steps led into the main building of the palace. This consisted of 8 divisions, each made of a different quality, while the whole was built in a star-shaped form, so that each division, with its subdivisions, was connected directly with the central chamber occupied by the king. But what was most curious about it was that in each division, some special invisible genie or spirit seemed to preside, for in each a peculiar influence differing from the rest could be felt by anyone whose nerves were not made of cast iron, or who was not a blockhead. Thus the hall of the mushrooms on the north side breathed an air of luxury and enjoyment, while the room to the left of it was pervaded by a spirit of anxiety and dissatisfaction, and was visited only by those who by force of habit had become attracted to it, and who, so to say, found satisfaction only in being always dissatisfied, chronic grumblers, misanthropes, people discontented with themselves and with everything. On the other hand, there were 2 rooms to the east, in which nobody could remain without being overcome by a feeling of awe, reverence, generosity, sublimity, and a deep religious sentiment. They were visited by the brightest of the gnomes, and served as a place for contemplation. These rooms seemed to be empty, but they were not empty, because while they were bare of all objects, they were filled with an overwhelming abundance of that spirit which is the creator or producer of forms. The southeastern portion of the palace contained the sleeping apartments of the royal family, and whoever entered there would sink into a state of torpor and forgetfulness. But the hall next to that, lying directly towards the south, inspired its inhabitants with a deep melancholy easily turned into anger. Another division towards the west was called the Chamber of Cunning, and used on certain occasions for the purpose of concocting schemes of revenge and intrigue. It was very seldom used at the time of my arrival, but became a favorite meeting room later on. As to the hall upon the north side, which was dedicated to all sorts of sensual enjoyments, it was the most attractive, but also the most dangerous of them all, and I am bound by promise not to divulge any of its mysteries. All these rooms were free of access to every gnome of good standing, but the division in the center, where the king resided, was only open to those who gained admission there. It was always guarded by a selected number of female soldiers corresponding to our Amazons, and it was said that female soldiers were always chosen in preference because they were more faithful and reliable than the males of the gnomes. At the entrance of the king's chamber, there were statues of gigantic size reminding me of the ones at the British Museum, which were brought there from Easter Island. They represented that prehistoric race of beings which the gnomes used to call man, or Homo divinus, and of which they claimed that it existed no more upon the planet Earth, having emigrated to other spheres and abandoned their country to hobgoblins, devils, and spooks. I must confess that in our country I never met with any human beings of such a superhuman aspect as was represented here. There were images of men and women of such noble mien and so awe-inspiring that they looked much more like gods than the specimens of the genus Homo bipex, and a resemblance to them can be found only among the statuary of the ancient Greeks. Here the king in person resided, and nobody dared to approach him without his consent, and without being admitted by the Amazons. But the apartments of the princess were next to those of the king, and as I spent a great deal of time in her company, I also became very frequently in contact with her father, the king. The most remarkable thing among the gnomes was that they could not distinguish falsehood from truth. They were incapable of saying anything else than what they themselves thought and believed, and they could not conceive of the possibility of telling a lie. This state of affairs was sometimes somewhat annoying, for it is not always agreeable to hear someone state his opinion about you right to your face. But on the other hand, it was advantageous in many respects. For instance, whenever I wanted to enter the chamber of the king, all I had to do was tell the Amazons that the king wanted to see me. And I believe if anyone had told the treasurer of the kingdom that he was entitled to take the treasurer away, the guardian would have delivered it up without hesitation. This, however, was only at the time of my arrival, and before an attempt of civilizing the gnomes was made. Time passed away rapidly, and I do not know how long I remained at the palace, enjoying the hospitality of the queen and the company of the princess. But each day I learned more to admire Dahlia's character, the simplicity of her way of thinking, and the purity of her affection. It is true that her want of modern education, her inability to hide her true sentiments, and her inexperience in the habits of modern civilization, especially in what refers to conventionalities, sometimes created a feeling of dissatisfaction in my mind. She did not know how to pretend sentiments which she did not experience. She knew nothing about logical quibbles and tergiversation, nor of the many sweet little lies that make life supportable among mankind. All right. You're going to go ahead and pause there. We are at 51% of the book's length. I'm going to make a quick adjustment on the book tracker. And for anyone who is curious about the book tracker, it is in the links on my About page. Thank you to anyone who is watching this VOD after it finishes being aired. I appreciate you. And if you're not already following me, please do. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, and make sure to leave a comment as well. Any sort of engagement will help appease the god of the algorithm. I will be back later this evening for our bedtime stories continuation of Treasure Island. If you wish to join us, please do. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Make sure that you take care of yourself. Take any meds you maybe haven't taken yet. Drink some water or something equally hydrating. If you have the ability to do so, go outside and take a big deep breath. And if you have any furry loved ones, make sure to give them a kiss on the head from me. See you next time.